there's just so many different types of eaters. Most kids, there's a reason why they seem picky, but just like with learning at school, and they're learning about food. And if you think about it, we don't expect our toddlers to read novels, but we kind of expect them to eat all these complicated foods. And the reason for that we think that is because when they're babies, they eat so much. And so we kind of get this honeymoon phase. We don't know it's honeymoon. And then all of a sudden they become picky and you're like, what happened to my good eater?
Welcome to the Wise Consumer Podcast, the answer to your eco-friendly and healthy lifestyle questions. How to reduce your exposure to harmful chemicals, whether or not it's normal to have a painful period, how to live an eco-friendly lifestyle on a budget, and more. With the help of experts, I'm talking scientists, toxicologists, endocrinologists, cosmetic chemists, you'll get knowledge and know-how to your most pressing health concerns and sustainability questions straight from the source. I'm Madeline Weisskopf, your host, confidant, and in-house science nerd, here on a mission to help empower, inspire, and support you in your own health and eco journey. Because, friend, I am a firm believer that if you don't feel good, you can't do good. So, pour yourself a cup of tea, kick off your shoes, take a deep breath, and let's get started. Hello, friend. Welcome to another episode of the Wise Consumer Podcast. If you're new to the show, welcome. I am so glad that you've tuned in. And if you're a show regular, well, welcome back. I am super happy you're tuning in for another episode. So before we kick off the conversation today, I want to share that I'm going to be structuring this episode a bit differently. Usually when I bring a guest onto the podcast, I like to structure the episode in a Q&A format. But today I want to change things up a bit. I want to format this in a way that's more story-like, to take you on a journey per se, as we explore the topic of pediatric nutrition with my guest today, Maryann Jacobsen. I just feel it's nice to change things up every so often, and who knows, maybe you'll actually prefer this approach. So if you do, you gotta let me know. And if you hate it, you also gotta let me know. I prepare, record, and edit each of these episodes for you, so I want to know what style most resonates with you. Additionally, I want to take a few moments to share that we are coming to the end of season 4 of the Wise Consumer Podcast. If you've been following along, you may have heard me mention throughout a few preceding episodes that I am, well, let's just say pregnant. And this baby is making its grand entrance into the world in just a few short weeks. To be honest, I am freaking out, but also excited. So I'm going to be taking some maternity leave. And then, of course, we'll relaunch the show with season 5 sometime after the new year. So if you want to keep in touch while I'm on maternity leave and get updates about the podcast launch, make sure to subscribe to my newsletter. I've added a link in the show notes, so check that out when you have a moment. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's get started with today's conversation. Today, we're going to be exploring a topic a lot of you have approached me about over the course of the past few months, and one I've personally been exploring on my own as I enter this new chapter of motherhood, and that's childhood nutrition. More specifically, how to raise a healthy eater, especially if your little eater tends to be on the quote pickier side. Now, there are so many avenues we can explore when it comes to childhood nutrition, and trust me, we will explore various aspects of this field in more detail over the course of the next few seasons. But today I thought we'd just take a general look at this topic. For instance, how do you get a picky eater to try and explore new foods? Or what's the difference between picky eating and problem feeding? And is it okay to use food as a parenting tool with your kids? If these are questions you've been asking yourself as a parent and you're looking for a bit of guidance, then you're going to love this conversation with my guest today, Maryann Jacobsen. Maryann is a registered dietitian and a family nutrition expert who empowers families to create a healthy relationship with food for optimal health and well-being. She is the author of multiple books, including How to Raise a Mindful Eater, The Family Dinner Solution, and along with registered dietitian and pediatric nutrition specialist Jill Castle, co-wrote the book Fearless Feeding: How to Raise Healthy Eaters from High Chair to High School. So I cannot recommend this book, Fearless Feeding, enough. It was actually this book that led me and introduced me to Maryann, and one of the reasons I invited her onto the podcast, because I wanted to explore and hear her point of view on some of the topics she explores in this book. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the first topic I wanted to explore with Maryann was picky eating, as this is a question I get asked about a lot and which I myself have given a lot of thought to. I mean, there are so many reasons behind why a child may or may not want to eat something, try something new. And let's be honest, this drives most parents up the wall. Now, I personally haven't experienced this frustration myself, but from what I hear, dealing with a picky eater can make a parent go bananas. So, of course, I asked Maryann about this, and she had so many insightful tips. So I want to start with picky eating because I think that's something a lot of my listeners are dealing with. And first, I'd like, if possible, if you could answer, help us define picky eating, because I realize there's picky eating and then there's like problem feeding. So how would you define picky eating, and is picky eating actually even a thing?
Well, if you look at the research, like more than half of parents complain of picky eating when kids are young, their toddler age. That's when it peaks from age 2 to 5. So kind of right before they enter kindergarten or school. So yeah, that's kind of the key time that kids also, if you understand like fearless feeding, we talk about growth, their growth slows way down. They just spent 2 years, fastest growth of their life. You know it because you're changing their clothes. And they're really, most are good eaters. I don't like to say good, but they just have a hearty appetite.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my son would just, as long as we had food, he ate so much food in that stage. But then their growth slows. So picky eating, the typical is they might not eat much for one meal. Then the next meal, they finish it. And then they just kind of pick at dinner. And then in a couple of days, they'll eat a ton. Like it's not predictable. And they start rejecting previous foods, usually, green vegetables. Their mind is developing too. So they start looking more at food, like in a skeptical way, where before they just kind of, even if they make a funny face, they'd still eat it, especially when, if you spoon feed. So it's usually they have more than 20 foods. They eat from most food groups, maybe not vegetables as much, but at least they'll eat fruit, and most textures they'll do like yogurt. But they're just like, they're not predictable. That's kind of typical. They kind of reject. They're just not as hungry all the time, but sometimes they are. So that's kind of typical picky eating. It's more serious when there's a new food and they tantrum, or they have less than 20 foods, or they start spitting out that certain textures. Just you can just tell they just can't eat certain textures, like maybe they don't have soft, or they don't like crispy. So those are signs that it might be something more serious that you might want to get evaluated. And then their weight is definitely, like, if their growth isn't on track because you're still taking them, and I forget exactly the toddler phase, I think it's yearly by then, or maybe it's every 6 months, I forget. But they track the growth chart, and you kind of want to make sure your kid's on this line. And if they're growing fine, and they're just some meals, they're not, like I said, they're just not as hungry. In the book, we kind of give more definition in fearless feeding, so you can, and I have some articles on my blog too to help. But I think parents also trusting your instinct, something's just not right. You might want to get it, evaluation just in case.
So for the picky eater, I feel like this is really frustrating for a lot of parents. Like so problem feeding aside, because that's like a whole other field.
Yeah.
I'm going to focus primarily, for lack of a better term, picky eating. So for the parent whose child is just like refuses anything but kid food, because I have so many friends and even women who've reached out, and they're just like, they won't eat anything but like the pizzas and the, chicken nuggets, and anything else they just won't touch. And it's really frustrating. What advice can you give to that parent who's like in that like mode right now?
I would, also let parents know that kids don't do that great at dinner, usually around 2, 3, 4 anyway. So they're not always hungry, they're tired. So, a side strategy, serve the same meal, make meal plan, but make sure there's, a couple different sides. So if it's a meal you're not sure they'll eat, maybe you put out fruit, you put out some bread. And I know, we don't want them to eat bread and fruit, but hopefully at lunch, if you make their lunch, they're in preschool, breakfast, you got to consider the whole day over time. And you just really take the pressure off. So I like family style meals, put out bowls, let them serve themselves if they can, help them if they can't. And really just, the pressure just makes them, want to say no. Toddlers say no, they're exerting their independence. You can also do a learning plate. That's something, if they don't want to, they're like, no, say, put a plate on the side and let them learn about the food. Let them, touch it, lick it or whatever, it takes pickier kids, more time to warm up to food. You want to, the 1 bite rule can work for usually kids that aren't that picky. So it's kind of ironic. Like if it's causing any stress, you could try a 1 bite rule. I never did that, but there are some kids, if you have that and they start eating, then, you can tell if it's working. If they really reject or it makes them upset, then it's like, it's not worth it. So, cause there's always those parents that's like, just have them take a bite and, and like, that's all I did with my kids, but that doesn't work for, the parents out there, your kid. So yeah, it's just a matter of the family dinner solution was my attempt at revamping our meals, finding out the ones that worked for us, having a plan. What do I need? Do I need more fish dishes? Do I need more veggie sides? And then I had a side strategy when I do Mexican food. It's always tortillas and beans, and you can make your own burrito, but there's a different protein. Maybe I'll do shrimp, I'll do turkey, ground turkey. So, if you take some time when you got these young kids to really kind of revamp and work on your meals that really work. And then like now it's years later, I have so many more, I still like to meal plan, but I can wing it too, where before it was more difficult. So yeah, I think knowing that this is pretty typical, that there's no guarantee they're going to eat dinner, don't stress yourself out. Make sure they're getting opportunity to eat vegetables and fruits at lunch, at breakfast. So it's not like sometimes dinner is the only balanced meal sometimes. And so we feel that pressure. But if you really make an effort to have them eat variety at other times, then dinner can kind of be this just place you all come together. There's no pressure. It takes a while, and it's an investment that you may not think is paying off, but later, now that I have older kids, they're very flexible. They can go to other places. Not that they always eat it, but they're just used to, okay, this is what you're offered. There's no stress. So, at first you might be like, well, they're not eating, but they really, it's this kind of gradual exposure, and, they're getting used to the way things are, and it takes time.
Patience. It sounds like be patient, because it may take time to try different. I love the idea of the learning plate. So even if they don't eat it, maybe just have it, on so they can touch it. And it's like very textile. Food is very textile,
Yeah. And they need to know, like, we want them to take that bite, but for really picky kids, I think Kay Toomey, she's a psychologist that works in this area. I think it takes pickier kids like many more steps to, so they need, just more experience with the food, and, then maybe a less picky kid that's just, will eat it. But, there's just so many different types of eaters. Most kids, there's a reason why they seem picky, but there's still like big variety. You can go over there and you're like, oh my gosh, this kid eats so much different foods. But it doesn't, they're just on their own little, like, just like with learning at school, and they're learning about food. And if you think about it, we don't expect our toddlers to read novels, but we kind of expect them to eat all these complicated foods. And the reason for that we think that is because when they're babies, they eat so much. And so we kind of get this honeymoon phase. We don't know it's honeymoon. And then all of a sudden they become picky, and you're like, what happened to my good eater? But when you understand that's how they develop and grow, then,
Yeah, there's a term I came across which I thought was fascinating, and like I wish I had. I'm obviously, this isn't my field, but food neophobia. Once I learned that term, which I would love for you to define, and how it applies to that quote picky eating stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, is a like evolved because back in the day, hunter and gatherers, kids would get poisoned from food if they just ate anything. And when they become mobile, um, so bitter foods, which tend to be like the greens and some vegetables, they're more skeptical. So there's a reason why they're fearful, because as they become mobile back in the day, the picky eater that was afraid of new foods or different was actually the one that survived, if you can think of it that way. Now it's like, yeah, it can cause problems. Like, so you got to expose them and they see you eat it and they're like, okay, it's safe. But food nephobia is just fear of new food. And when it's really extreme and they can't even sit next to a different food, that's when something's going on. And there's a lot that can be done to help them,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of new therapies and whatnot. But most kids will just kind of, when it's new and different, and if you think about something you're afraid of, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't like roller coasters. The more someone pressures me, the more I don't want to do it.
Right.
So when there's a food nephobia, the more you pressure them, they're already scared. It's just like, no. And then if they eat it out of that pressure and it's bad experience, then it really puts them back. So it's just better to be like, okay, and explain what the food is, give them chances in preparing it to get what it feels like. They see you eating it. And then sooner, like my kids, it's always been when I'm not even talking about it, all of a sudden, like, my son doesn't love fruit and he's slowly added them on through the years. And like I have this cantaloupe, which I love in the summer because it's so good. It's Tuscan melon, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I cut up some and he just goes and starts eating it. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is just out of nowhere. So that, I bought it like every week after that. So yeah, I mean, it's always like that with my kids. It's never when I'm like, come on, let's eat it, or when I say anything. My daughter's always been the same way too. So, but all kids are different. Sometimes encouragement can help.
Mm-hmm.
One kid can look at encouragement as pressure. Another kid that might help them. So know your kid.
So, friend, what I'm learning here is that feeding our children is a learning experience, both for the child and the adult. I mean, there is no manual handed to a parent at birth that walks us through various scenarios of what to do if X, Y, or Z happens when you're feeding your child, right? I mean, that would be amazing to have a blueprint, but unfortunately, it just doesn't exist. So give yourself some grace as you maneuver through this phase of their developmental stage, because from what we're hearing from Maryann is that it does take a lot of consistency, persistence, and patience. And in fact, one study I came across shared that it can take certain kids up to 8 to 10 tries before they actually accept a new food. And for some kids, it may even take more tries. But if you think about it, the same could be said for adults, right? When my family moved to Korea in my early 20s, I was not a fan of kimchi. I thought it smelled funky and looked kind of unappetizing, to be honest. But the more it was offered to me and the more I ate it, the more I came to love it. In fact, today, if you open my fridge, you will always find a jar of kimchi. I mean, always. It's actually one of the foods that I crave the most right before my period. I know that sounds so weird, but, and maybe it has something to do with my gut microbiome being off balance before my period. I don't know. That's a topic for another day, but all that to say, even as an adult, it took me time to learn to appreciate new and different foods. So the lesson here is to be patient with our kids as we introduce new foods and textures into their diets as well. Because I'm sure if you think about it, there are most likely foods that even you as the parent, the adult, may either still be unwilling to try or you just don't like it. So let's extend a little grace to our children every so often when they're first trying out new foods. So something else I've come across in my research, and honestly I see a lot in my daily life, is parents using food to bribe kids, i.e. using food as a parenting tool. Again, if this is something you find yourself doing, don't sweat it. Parenting is hard, and sometimes, as you'll hear Maryann share, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But I wanted to hear more of her perspective on this and any tips or insights she could share with us when it came to using food as a parenting tool. kids are challenging sometimes. So I understand people being like, oh, are you being fussy? Why don't you do you want a cookie? Or, oh, we're going for the car ride. Like, let me have you be quiet. So I'll give you a cookie in the car. Or,
Mhm.
what's your advice around, well, what is not using food as a parenting tool? And what is your advice for parents who maybe are in the thick of this?
I think it's better to use other tools. I think, anything you do repeatedly, if it's just once in a while, save that for like when you really need it. Like when
Mm-hmm.
it's just, I don't know, you're on a
Eight
car trip.
hour car drive.
Yeah,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
it's just like your survival, but it's always repetition. We learn from repetition. So if
Mm.
you're not doing it all the time, even if you've been doing it, don't ever give yourself a hard time because being
Yeah.
the hardest job. And some kids it doesn't affect the same way, but definitely don't. Kids will start, the research shows they're more likely to be emotional eaters because what you're doing is you're using the emotions and food, you're bringing them together.
Mm.
It's like, be good and you can have this. So they're thinking being good, and what does that translate to later? And we know this research shows there's a link there between adults who emotionally eat and their kids and their parents doing this kind of,
Mm.
what is it called? Emotion. I forget the name for it. But emotion feeding or if they're bad, they're like, you can't have dessert. So then food becomes elevated and it takes on a different meaning than hunger and enjoyment, which what it should be. It should be enjoyed. Sometimes you're not always hungry, but I mean, for
Yeah.
the most part, hunger guides your eating. But it takes on all this, and then it makes, oh my gosh, dessert's so good. They took it away, and then they just, that's when a lot of eating problems can come up. So I just, say leave food out of it, find something else
Mm-hmm.
to, I mean, and I think if you have a difficult child, definitely take a good parenting class. There's a PET. I have a friend who's a teacher, parenting effectiveness training. You know, just invest in that because you'll learn a lot of it can just save you, because
Yeah.
a lot of times the kids with eating problems are difficult. They might have a certain temperament and parents may need a little bit
Mm.
more guidance and help. So yeah, I mean, you kind of want to just not bring food in.
Mm-hmm.
I was desperate when my son was toilet training,
Mm-hmm.
and he had to be toilet trained to go into preschool to
Mm-hmm.
the next like, and so like he wouldn't even. I used M&Ms just to keep his underwear on because we were doing. And it was like I was desperate. I'm like looking, and he
Yeah.
doesn't remember that, and I didn't use it all the time, but it was like I'm bringing out the big. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
now looking back, it's like, so yeah, like it's just, and as a dietitian working with adults, I would see that like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the food problems start in childhood. And, so I'd always ask, like, clean your plate, asking, people with eating problems and, eat past fullness because they just eat everything on their plate. So if you think about it, their brain's developing, you learn most about food until you're 18, and so if an adult is having problems, sometimes you can look back and be like, okay, I learned this growing up, but this I can learn a different way now.
Mm-hmm.
So parents, if we're having trouble, maybe, we can look at our children and kind of we're teaching them, and then we can also,
Mm-hmm.
because this is like a family thing. You can't
Yeah.
be, eating out of boredom, like while you're watching TV, but you don't want your kid to, they're going to know. And, so it's good for everybody. And,
Right.
I eat very structured. You don't have to be like, you kind of know when you get hungry, you should be hungry for, when people say, oh, eat small meals, eat, when are you hungry? Like I'm usually hungry 2 to 3 hours after breakfast. So I eat something, and
Mm-hmm.
that's, when I have lunch. And then if I'm hungry depends, lunch and dinner, I'll have something. If I'm not, then I just, have dinner.
Another topic I've been exploring when it comes to early childhood nutrition, and one I've been trying to understand better for myself as I become a mom, is that of snacking. So this seems to be an issue that we as a country are having a hard time, for lack of a better word, managing. Now, I explore this topic in more detail in episode 83 with food advocate Bettina Siegel, author of the book Kid Food. But here are a few additional fast facts that I thought you might find interesting. In a recent study I came across, I read that the average American child today is getting 586 calories a day from snacks, which represents an almost 200 calories a day increase compared with snack calories consumed by children a generation ago. And many school-age kids, about 1 in 5, they found, are snacking up to 6 times a day. And unfortunately, they're not eating like quote unquote healthy snacks such as cheese, fruits, or nuts. The snacks reported in these studies generally refer to candy, crackers, and cookies. Now, I don't share this stat to make you feel bad or guilty, and I certainly don't believe that snacks are bad. In fact, snacks are a great way to get extra nutrients into our children. I think we just need to be a bit more cognizant of what snacks we give our kids and how often. As Jill Castle shares on her blog, The Nurse Child, quote, offering food with nutrients that help kids feel full, namely protein, fiber, and healthy fats, is the name of the snacking game, end quote. Not only that, but kids who snack throughout the entirety of the day tend to eat less at mealtime when more nutritious foods are generally being offered. So personally, I feel as though snacks should be a bridge to hold our kids and ourselves over from one meal to the next, not a meal replacement, which unfortunately it has become in a lot of households. So, of course, I wanted to get Maryann's perspective on this. Should snacks be made available throughout the day? Should they be visible or hidden away? Or what if all your kid ever wants to eat our snack foods? For example, one of my sisters will make a hearty dinner for the entire family, but when she puts the dinner in front of her toddler, he often refuses to eat it, asking instead only for snacks. So this drives her insane. And when I told her I was speaking to Maryann, she's like, make sure to ask her, what would Maryann say? How would she handle this kind of a situation? Because it's driving me bonkers. So here's what Maryann had to share. She'll make foods that she knows he likes, but he'll just get up from the dinner table and say, like, I want snack foods that are out on the shelf or the counter. So should snacks be made available throughout the day? Should they be visible to children? What age should snacks be made available to children, etc.?
Well, yeah. No, I mean, I think there's times to eat. And then as Jill Castle, I wrote the book with, she talks about the kitchen's closed. And the kitchen's closed. It's your time to eat. So with that kid, if they come and say, I don't want to eat, say, that's okay. You don't have to eat. But the rule in our house is everyone sits at the table. Mm-hmm. So you don't engage in that battle, because then it's like, yes, you have to eat. And then it's like the battle. So most of the time I find that they do eat, especially if there's something there that they, again, those safety foods, you have. And so, if it might take, if you haven't been doing it that way, it's great to talk to that kid and say, look, we're going to be changing some things. We're not going to eat between, the kitchen's going to be closed. I'll remind you, really give them a lot of support if you're going to make a change. Don't just like spring it on them.
Yeah.
So then it's like, and if they get upset, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, no, this is hard, but you'll figure it out. A lot of empathy. If you think about it, that's how we're just so much more responsive. And it doesn't matter what age, whether it's a kid or adult. No one likes to be forced to do stuff. It's just human nature. So, know that this might be hard for kids, but give them empathy and like, I'm here for you. And then they'll really talk to you more, and, it'll just be a lot. But yeah, I wrote this article, like the 5 end mealtime battles with these 5 words. And it's like, you don't have to eat. Yeah. You don't have to eat. They never have to eat. Like, just let them know that up front. And that, counterintuitive as it sounds, it really just puts the pressure off. And then let them know, that we're not going to have snack foods after this. That's for snack time, and so.
So if you don't have to eat, let's say that is, so my mom is French, and she was pretty strict. And if you didn't eat what was on the dinner table, you didn't eat. So after, let's say you don't have to eat this, but then like an hour later, like you mentioned, the kid's like, well, I actually am hungry and I want the snack. So what do you do? Or what do you recommend?
So then you're like, I'm sorry you didn't eat. Tomorrow you get a chance to do it again. One of the things that we do, so it's kind of the same thing like your mom, but it's just a softer approach.
Yeah, my mom was very.
And it's having things at the table too. So kind of, but you can have fruit is always a yes. We talk about that. So, that's kind of a harmless thing. So, if they're really hungry at any time, you can have fruit. You can have an apple, you can have banana. And so fruit is always a yes, can kind of be like, they get some fruit. It's pretty, it's got
Yeah.
nutrition. It usually doesn't fill them up too much. But, so I think a fruit is always a yes. It's kind of a, kids usually like fruit.
I love that
Is,
tip, actually. I think that's a really
yeah.
good tip. So if they don't want something, instead of being like, well, I want Cheez-Its or, goldfish, that's off the table. But if they want the fruit because they didn't eat dinner, they can have fruit.
Because sometimes when they say I'm hungry, kids learn when they're young. I'm hungry means I just want to have, they may not be hungry and they're not lying
Mm-hmm.
intentionally, but then they want this cheese it. So like it's kind of, we talk about the hunger test. If you say, well, if you're hungry, yeah, you can have some fruit. So if they don't eat the fruit, they may not be hungry. I mean, it's not an absolute, but so I think that helps to solve that. Some kids just really want that snack food.
Another topic that I thought was super interesting in Fearless Feeding was the topic of structured eating versus grazing. And I quote, grazing is when children eat with no structured meal or plan. The kids are able to go to the kitchen cabinet and grab crackers or goldfish whenever they want. They snack in the car while watching TV and in the grocery store. The main meal happens, but the kids eat too much or too little because they're either not hungry or they're famished, end quote. Structured eating, on the other hand, is when there's rhythm to meals and snacks, and between meals, the kitchen is closed. Or as Maryann shares with me,
Structure, it makes food, you're telling your kid, look, eating's important. But structure and having meals planned, it helps kids feel safe around food. They know that there's always a meal, a snack. When you're kind of freewheeling, sometimes even though it may not be food insecure, or it could be, that's what happens is they get a little like unsure of, when is the next meal, when, it just really helps them
mm,
feel confident. They know, every few hours they're going to have something to eat. And the structure just it really helps them. And also there was one study that showed structure, type of eating with kids, they tend to be less picky because they have more opportunities, they're exposed, even if they're not always eating. And if you look at research in like college students, those preferences, the foods that were offered to them, not necessarily the foods they liked when they were kids, but that's what they tend to eat when they get older. So you're kind of, if you think about it, like you're showing them, even though it's a pain for me sometimes, like, I don't want to put out those raw fruits and vegetables this one meal. I'm like, oh, I'll just do it, even though there's a salad, which sometimes they eat or they may not eat. But they get used to that, and then they're like, well, where is the fruits and vegetables? You're like, oh yeah.
mm-hmm,
uh,
mm-hmm.
so even though you think maybe they don't care, that's how they're learning. So the structure, I think, and as an adult, that's just how I grew up, kind of with the eating while watching TV, very mindless eating a lot. And I had brothers and sisters, and we fight over dessert, and so I was like obsessed with food. And so as I got older, I discovered during my internship that, I had to eat meals at the hospital and I had no food in my dorm. And so I was like, wow, I'm actually hungry. I was eating like 3 meals, maybe, a snack. And it was like, wow, this is just a lot. You just eat when you're hungry, have regular meals. And then I just stopped that habit of having to eat at night, and just that automatic TV's on, I need a snack. And it just really changed my whole, I liked nutritious food, but I was able to eat sweets in moderation. I don't know. It was like a whole transformation, a little more intuitive eating that's
Yeah,
really popular now. I didn't know intuitive eating, but that's kind of what I was learning, to
yeah.
kind of listen to my body. When I eat, give food my full attention, stop when I'm full, enjoy it. And then I don't have to think about food until the next, where before I was thinking about food all the time.
Right.
Um,
So
so
you recommend for children, for parents, even though it would be so much easier to just be like, here's Mickey Mouse while we're eating, to just, you recommend, if possible, whenever, again, don't be so hard on yourselves if you need to do
mhm.
it, but no TV, no books, you just sit at the table and you make it a pleasant experience out of it, correct?
For sure. And it's really, when they're little, it is kind of, I know Sally at Real Mom Nutrition wrote this post about when her kids were little, like you're doing it and you're like, just, it's going to get better. And you'll have nights where like, actually, this wasn't too bad. And then slowly, I wrote this one post about meal times, all about connection. And if you really focus on that instead of the meal that wasn't eaten, or, because that's just, who knows, but yeah, I mean, and just invest in those family meals. A lot of research shows that kids do better that have family meals, lower risk of eating disorders, they eat more variety. So just know that family meal, don't be so hard on what the actual food is, and having to have it super healthy. Just get those family meals and just, start there. And if you're not doing anything, just pick one thing. If the TV's on, don't worry, later you can address the TV. And once you get the structure down, then maybe you stop the TV, but you really want them to focus on their food. There's something called meal memory. So when you eat while you're doing other things, studies show you eat more at the next meal, because you don't remember when you don't pay attention. It's kind of like, talking to my husband sometimes, he's telling me things, I'm not paying attention. Later, he's like, I told you that. And I'm like, oops.
Yeah.
It's the same with food, like that meal memory. Only if it's just rare that I even eat while I'm, like lunch today, I'll eat at the table. It takes me 15 minutes. I can spare that. Versus, on my computer.
And that's good for all ages, like adults as well. Like I really like what you said, like what you do with what you're trying to instill in your children. It's actually good for the whole family. Like everyone turns their phones off because, like, Lord knows we're all so connected right now. Like no phones at the dinner table, no distraction. It's time for connectedness and being mindful about what we're eating and being gentle with ourselves. I really like that approach.
Yeah, and even if, let's say you get pizza, I'll just still put out the fruit. I always have this container, it'll have like some fruits, cut up fruit and vegetable, like carrots and celery. And I pretty much always put that out. I usually like to make a salad too. So even if, I like those kind of, or if it's just been one of those days, we have these frozen pizzas from Costco, and I'll make a salad in that. And I'll sometimes put toppings, like veggie toppings on them. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be,
a 4-course dinner. Exactly.
Yeah, you can do like a big thing, like deli meat and cheese and some nuts. And, Fridays are supposed to be, I always post a rotation, my finger food. Because, Fridays, just put it out there. And, it doesn't really have to be, sometimes I do this too. It's like, it's freeing to know I can just make something really easy.
Personally, I've always loved structured family meals. This was a really important concept and tradition in my family growing up, and one I really want to continue with my own little family. Will it be perfect? Absolutely not. But enjoying meals together around the dinner table is something I've always valued and enjoyed, and find to be a great way to connect with those you love. Okay, so as we near the end of this episode, I asked Maryann to share a few final tips with us. So before you continue on your merry way today, here are 3 final tips Maryann shared that I found to be extremely helpful.
I think, excluding baby, because what babies are learning, but having structure, just how you eat is just as important as what, so structure and, letting kids, always asking them when they're done, are you full or are you still hungry? Instead of, do you want more? Really having them tune in to hunger and fullness. Just learning how to, supply a variety of food. That's your job. We didn't really talk about LNSAT or division of responsibility, but it's a kid's job to decide, how much and what to eat. But it's your job to get the meals on the table, set the time of the meals and the tone. And then most of all, just enjoy the time together. Try not to get hung up on what the food part, because, just make that a fun, now that my kids are older, it's really nice when we come together and we just laugh about, like, and then we find out more about school, and as my daughter gets older, I mean, she just started high school, but I know in a couple of years from what I hear, you don't see them very much. So we'll try and do this as much as we can. But yeah, just, the structure, variety, and fun.
Well, there you have it, friend. That about wraps everything up. Personally, I thought this was a super helpful and insightful conversation. I absolutely loved chatting with Maryann, and I really hope you found value in this conversation and that you're able to walk away with a few practical tips you can try to implement yourself. Now, if you're looking for more information, more tips and resources when it comes to coping with picky eaters or how to raise a healthy eater, make sure to check out Maryann's blog at www.maryanjacobsen.com and to connect with her on social media. I've provided all of these links in the show notes, along with links to all of her books, including Fearless Feeding, which, as you know, I highly recommend. This truly is a really helpful book if you're a parent. So, all right, that's it for me today. Sending you health and happiness, and I hope you're having a great day wherever you're tuning in from. Hi, friends. As always, just ending this episode with my obligatory disclaimer. Please remember, the Wise Consumer is intended for educational purposes only. The content being shared here should not be used as a substitute for professional care by your healthcare provider. I am not a qualified medical expert, nor do I pretend to be, so please note that the content and research I share and explore on this podcast is not intended to treat or diagnose you. If you have any medical questions, concerns, or wish to make changes to your diet, please speak to your physician or any qualified healthcare professional for that matter. The Wise Consumer may not be held responsible for your health, dietary, or lifestyle decisions. I am simply here to encourage you to seek healthier, more eco-friendly, and conscious alternatives. While the Wise Consumer podcast offers information from many sources, the opinions expressed are solely those of the Wise Consumer and not those of any affiliate or other entity. Additionally, while I always do my best to source and research the most up-to-date and accurate information, I realize science is continually evolving. If you come across any scientific information that is blatantly incorrect, please kindly email me at hello@thewiseconsumer.com. And finally, this podcast and any other offerings of The Wise Consumer may contain copyrighted material, the use of which has not always been specifically authorized by the copyright owner because it is being used for educational purposes. If you wish to use copyrighted material from this podcast or any other offerings of The Wise Consumer for purposes of your own that go beyond fair use, you must obtain permission from the copyright owner.